He would research group dynamics. He would come to senior meetings. He would come to all meetings, and he'd be there with his notebook. And then, he'd write ethnographic reports, and we'd go through them. He'd say, "Look, I'm seeing 4 things here. This isn't working here. This team doesn't talk to this team." It was absolutely eye-opening.
Hello, this is Shirley Kavanagh, and you are very welcome to the Leadership Discoveries podcast. Here I chat with leaders and experts across a variety of sectors and geographies who share their experience and views on a range of leadership topics. I'm delighted today to be joined by Richard Cotter. Richard is responsible for Allianz Ireland's organisational development and research agenda. And this wide-ranging agenda includes organisational change, learning, culture and leadership development. And I'm really interested to talk to Richard a little bit more about this culture piece. But first of all, Richard, you're very welcome.
Thank you, Shirley. Thanks for having me. Looking forward to the conversation.
Great, thank you. So, Richard, maybe could you start off by telling us about your role and where your attention is currently focused?
My role is organisation development and research. So I head up a small team of people within a wider people and culture function within the company, which we, I suppose, HR squared, you might call it. It has all the traditional human resource roles, plus a few extra, plus kind of an internal consultancy wing, if you like, where we look after leadership development, culture, communications, the learning agenda, in very close contact with our HR brothers and sisters as part of the wider people and culture function in which we all operate. Yeah, we also do strategy support as well. We would set up the strategy governance. We would run the strategy meetings with the top team. We'd prepare the strategy materials as well. And that's been, because of the culture work we did, it kind of very much led us into strategy. So that's interesting. We might talk about that later on, because the two obviously are connected, or people try to connect them. They don't always succeed.
And actually, Richard, that's really interesting. Could we talk about that now, in fact, because it's seldom I hear that very close connection between culture and strategy. So could you kind of tell us how that works? I think a lot of people would be interested to hear more about that.
And this is one of the benefits of being an organization development function, I think, which is that you have to see things holistically if you want to be effective. And I think, when you have teams that have a learning function, you have a leadership function, although they work together, they don't necessarily align their work. And when you're working on culture, it's really, as you know, and the listeners will know, it's kind of a catch-all, cover-all topic. It's holistic by definition, by its nature. So as we did our culture work, we found that we were improving collaboration, we were enhancing, meetings, we were changing meetings, we were introducing new spaces and mechanisms for people to collaborate and interact, which is what we believe culture is. And maybe we come to that again later on. And as we did so, we found that there were strategy execution gaps, opportunities for teams to better come together and execute the strategy. So, the strategy is grand. It's there in a deck somewhere. It's there in a PowerPoint slides. Everyone knows that the real challenge with strategy is usually implementation. If you've thought through your strategy, if you've done your market analysis, if you've thought it through, if you've had good discussions, if you've avoided groupthink and all that, you will end up with a strategy story and direction and set of information and guidance that you want people to follow. The problem is when when it goes out to in the wild, your strategy in the wild is where things get a bit hairy, and implementation is a classic strategy problem. So back to culture. So how does culture, and there's a lot of talk. I mean, the one that kills me, it breaks my heart. Culture eats strategy for breakfast. Like, I mean, I can't listen to it. It's as if like the two things, were competing with each other. Where in reality, like, your strategy is being executed within your culture, whatever that culture is. And if you can change that culture and make it more conducive to people being involved in the strategy, no one's eating anyone. It's a symbiosis between the way people are set up to work together and strategic instructions, how good, how clear, how inclusive they are coming from the top. So to put it, I suppose, in a metaphor maybe, or an image, the strategy was coming from the top down, but the culture was coming sort of from the bottom up to meet it, because and that's where the strategy was being executed in the field, on the ground, and our anthropological approach. Now, this is key, I think. Our anthropological approach, because it works in the field with people and how they do their jobs and how they interact together to do their jobs, not necessarily their values and beliefs and mindsets, which a lot of focus is sometimes given on, or rightly so, but probably too much so in our view. Because we were in the field working with how people interact and how they perform their own jobs, we were able to bring the strategy and that, which is culture, together to achieve, real collaboration and strategy execution benefits. One of our top team called our culture recently our secret weapon in strategy, which I thought was a really nice, a nice compliment, but B, a really good way of describing it. We've had a really record success commercially and business wise within the group and within our own market in the last few years. And one of the reasons, certainly not the only one, but one of the reasons would be the way we set our people up to work together, which is what we call our culture.
That's really interesting. I mean, there's so many things in there, Richard, that you just said. I'm absolutely with you on the culture eat strategy for breakfast, I have to say. I hear that thrown out a lot by people. I'm not entirely sure there's a lot of understanding of what they're actually talking about. However, I'm really interested in this anthropology piece that you mentioned, because I'm not sure that would be very familiar to people in terms of what you're talking about there. So, one of the things you did do was you recruited a business anthropologist. So I think I've got a number of questions around that actually. Why, in the first place? What prompted you to do that? And what does that actually mean in the organization for what you're trying to do on culture?
So why did we do it? Well, at the time, any local entity of a multinational, as you know, is driven by the wins from corporate headquarters. So corporate headquarters in Munich had a strategy change of direction, a new CEO, and with that came the cultural instruction to become X culture. In this case, it was kind of around inclusivity and all of that, which is brilliant. So we had this cultural instruction from group to change the culture to support the new strategic direction. So, and it was a big program and it was going to be managed across the globe and people were going to be checking that, we were doing it and there was going to be engagement measurements around it and stuff like that. So, it was taken seriously and it had to be, rightly so. We said, I remember sitting down with my manager at the time thinking, okay, well, how are we going to do this, And it was kind of like, well, yeah, like, I mean, we're really going to do this. So I was thinking, well, if we really want to do it, we all know there was enough people in the people and culture team at the time. We had all been around the block a load of times. We all knew what didn't work in terms of
Hmm.
culture. And I said, well, are we going to do that again? He says, I wouldn't really want to do that. I will, we can all phone it in, and you know what we're talking about. It's getting the consultant in, it's doing the survey, it's having a workshop around values, it's putting some posters up, and it's part of the job. But I knew from my own experience in other organizations and other countries and in working in this space that look, that's usually superficial enough and it does a job, but it's just the paint cracks after a while. You're just painting over something, and the trick is to try to change to something. We came up with this idea. Well, who knows most about culture? Well, cultural anthropologists, that's their speciality. Now, how did I know about that? And it was me who proposed it. I'd done a PhD in Maynooth. I'd finished it a couple of years earlier. And as part of my methodology, there was ethnographic methods involved. And ethnographics methods are really simple. It's observation, participant observation. It's taking field notes. It's being in and around the action or the phenomenon that you want to research. So it can involve interviews, but it's not kind of like surveys and interviews as such. It's more being in the field, observation, and then interviewing people in a specific way. So it's an anthropological method. So I was familiar with ethnography, which is one of the tools of anthropology. And I had myself good success academically with that in terms of my PhD. And personally, I also found it to be an extremely informative way of finding out what was going on in an organization, observing people as they interact. Because when people talk to you, you're interacting with them on a one-to-one basis. But when you observe a bunch of people interacting together in the group dynamic, it's a whole different phenomenon. People themselves are different. They're better, maybe they're worse. You know what I mean? So anyway, I was familiar with this. So I said, look, essentially, look, cultural anthropologists really, really know culture. And they said, if we want someone to come in and help us to evolve and shape our culture, and I wasn't in bad shape, but it did need to be changed. Silos in particular were an issue. I said, look, let's hire a business anthropologist. And business anthropology was a thing. Anthropology as a discipline had moved into had moved into business, and there was even a journal of business anthropology. I don't know if it's still around. So yeah, it was a thing, but it was very rare. It was very unheard of. But we advertised for one, and I didn't know if we were going to catch a fish. We put the thing in anyway, and yeah, lo and behold, Dr. Robert Power from Maynooth, who'd been out in Maynooth in the School of Anthropology, teaching there, caught his eye, caught his attention. He came in, had an interview, and had another interview, and I think he was interviewing me more than me interviewing him, because one of the things he said to me was, "Are you guys really going to do this?" Which was the conversation we had had back in the ranch. But he was kind of going, "Look, are you going to waste my time here? Because I'm going to get into your organization. I'm going to dig into the organization. I'm not going to run a survey." And I knew that. So I think he was kind of thinking, will I be able to do my job fully here and effectively? And of course he was, because I knew what we were going to do, and I was able to explain to people, and where there was maybe a tiny bit of anxiety around it, talk to people around that. But really, from day one, it just clicked.
What was the reaction like when you said this? Because it's quite unorthodox in terms of a way, within an organization of, not doing the things that you actually said previously about the surveys, the value shop workshops, and all this sort of thing. Like, was it a hard sell basically into the organization?
I tell you, two things. The first reaction was, "Why do we need a business archaeologist?" And I was like, "No, no, 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 it's
Yeah.
anthropology." So I think people thought we were going looking for chalices under the building and stuff, but or bones. No, joking aside, we were lucky, right? And I can think of organizations where this would have been a hard sell. It wasn't a hard sell at all at Allianz, because thankfully the company hadn't gone through what a lot of companies I'd worked for previously. And I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but it can be a bad thing. There'd been a lot of change programs, and they were always almost wholly outsourced to consultants. Do you know what I mean? And the consultants would come in and they would do a thing. And I'm not anti-consultant, I'm pro-consultant, but I am anti using consultants in the wrong way. And I think good consultants are too. So that's my line on consultants. Allianz at the time didn't have a long history of that. So there was none of the jadedness, or none of the fatigue that can come with that. And also none of the skepticism that can come with that. Because oftentimes these don't work. And again, it's 9 times out of 10, it's not the consultant's fault. So we had a kind of a happily innocent sort of context in which to operate this, and we hadn't had huge change programs before because the organization was so successful. Now we had consultants in, but not to work on this topic per se. So they didn't know any different, which was positive. And to be fair, the people at Allianz, like, they're technical experts mostly, and they really valued the expertise. And when we said, "Look, this guy's coming in, he's PhD, he's published on business anthropology. He's an anthropologist." They were curious, and B, they were, he had the credentials in their eyes, and when he came in, then he had the personality, and he had the nous, surely, to make it work.
Really important. Yeah.
He was willing to learn a lot. I mean, anthropologists tend to go a bit native when when they go into settings. So he'd come back to meetings and he'd be telling me about underwriting guides and principles. He showed a willingness to learn about what people were doing and how they were doing it. And of course, that's how you gather cultural information. Do you know what I mean? So he would go to meetings, he would research group dynamics, he would come to senior meetings, he would come to all meetings, and he'd be there with his notebook, and then he'd write ethnographic reports, and we'd go through them. He'd say, "Look, I'm seeing 4 things here. This isn't working here. This team doesn't talk to this team." It was absolutely eye-opening.
Fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah, fascinating, because, like, surveys are great, but you know, you get very little information from a survey. I mean, you get very little information as to how people are actually acting. This goes into, now this is much more theoretical, and we would have talked about this in various conferences throughout the years. This goes to the heart of an anthropological approach. It's premised on the idea that culture is something that people do, and more importantly, people do together. So it studies interactions between people, and that is culture in every organization. So that's why sometimes there's a mismatch between, well, you're supposed to be an inclusive organization, but I don't see much inclusivity. You need to look for inclusivity, and you need to find it. And where it's not there, you need to create mechanisms or structures or procedures or processes in place to nudge inclusivity along, and sometimes even to force inclusivity in a good way. All of which can be done. So we felt that, and this was looking at the literature, and again, this is more theoretical side of it, but we saw in a lot of the organizational literature It was a lot of it was coming from the field of psychology. And the field of psychology is, and they're entitled to obviously, but it's concerned mostly with the mind. So most of the culture change literature and support that was being provided to practitioners was coming from the field of psychology. Ergo, it was more about here's how you change someone's mind. But but we very quickly rejected that approach as being way too difficult. You're trying to change one person's mind. You're trying to change 675 people's minds, so they all spark individually and come together to create this cultural conflagration. Like that's way too hard. It kind of smacked even to me at one stage of a kind of like a conversion job. You're trying to get people to say like, oh, here are our beliefs and here are our values. We value inclusivity, we value the individual. That's grand. But there can be a cosmological gap between how people behave on the ground and what they believe themselves because the situation changes. That was the heart of it all. So we went about changing the practices, and as we changed the practices, we changed the cultures.
That's really fascinating. I mean, it's very rare that you hear such a direct link between evidence and practice. There's a lot of talk about it, but it's great to actually hear an example. So when you had collected all of this information through Robert, turning it into something to change what the current status was, how did that happen, or how easy was it to do that, if you know what I mean? Was there a program of change, for instance, implemented, or was it an ongoing process that was actually happening?
Yeah, no, exactly. It was a program of change, and again, because the theory we were operating with was an anthropological one, and because the methods we were using were anthropological, we were able to make practical changes. We almost I won't say we knew they would succeed, but at the very least, we knew they would be tried. So we would have fresh data on whether they worked or not. And this is something that you cannot guarantee this with a psychological
Hmm.
approach. And again, I'm not knocking psychology. I'm just saying, like, and I'm not saying that culture isn't mental and people's beliefs and mindsets aren't important. They are important. But like the way I would describe it is like a dual carriageway. If you change someone's mind, you can change how they act for sure. But if you help someone or if you change the way they act or put them in a situation where action has to be taken this way, you can change their mind about it. And even if you don't, it doesn't matter. They're still doing the job the way they need to. We had data which allowed us to say we would review the reports, and Robert would say, "Look, there's a theme here across all the organization." And one of the themes is, I'll just give an example. Most people don't talk at the meetings. If there's a
Hmm.
meeting of 10 people, 2 people are doing all the talking. Well, that's not good. Why isn't it good? Well, A, it's not prima facie, it's not inclusive. Second of all, you don't know what these people are going to do after the meeting. You've no idea where they stand on things. You've no idea who they're going to tell, who they're not going to tell. A very simple thing then. Well, what do you do then with that? And you might get that in a survey. And you say, well, what do we do with it? But if you've observed it in action, you're in a much better position to, and here's what we did. We designed action and we designed structures and mechanisms. We call them mechanisms. You could call them processes, I suppose. We plumbed meetings in a certain way where everyone had to talk and everybody had to make a contribution, and a contribution was made in this way and it was structured. So it was very much designed. So what you're doing is you're designing action, or you're designing practices based on known areas of opportunity that you want to see, does it work? And then here's the kicker. Then you go and you're still in your anthropologist mode. Then you go and you observe it. And maybe you observe it for 5 or 6 runs and you say, okay, people aren't doing it. Why aren't they doing it? Or people are doing it. And here's the effect. So you're always there. You're always following up. You're always in the field, and you can make adjustments, because one thing, you're always guaranteed that someone's going to be trying something different.
Yeah.
Not something that can be guaranteed at all in other approaches, which are like, okay, well, here's the data, here's what we did, and off you go. You kind of left your own devices, and you're especially left your own devices if you get a consultancy in, because when you're an internal consultancy, you're always there. You're a permanent member of staff, you're a colleague, you are a consultant, but you're also a colleague, and also very importantly, you have skin in the game. Where there's silos in the business that are hurting the business, you have a vested interest in trying to fix them. You're part of the same team. So yeah, it was data, and it was action design. You call it action design or mechanism creation. Like, we created what we called smart circles. We got all the people who are having meetings about different parts of the business, And in and of themselves, those meetings had their own integrity and their own logic, and they were fine. But one logic they didn't have, they weren't joined up to the wider thing. So strategy execution was, let's say, suboptimal. Well, if you bring those people together in a smart circle, bring them together under the heading of a strategic rubric or objective, allow everybody to play their part, take their share of the task, and have a collaborative dynamic around it. It's amazing what can come up, you know. Some people pay cooperation costs, expected the bigger picture. Some people get more of what they want one week, but then the next week they have to take a hit. It's all a compromise. It's all, and you're really, what you're doing is you're trying to deal with all the politics in a positive way, because a lot of politics in organizations, and it leads to silos and whatnot. But what you're doing with the anthropological approach and collaboration is you're trying to get that good politics going. Good politics is when people are working together for the sake of a wider goal, and that's where culture and strategy meet. It is very deep. There's a lot of things to talk about, and again, I realize I'm just skimming on the surface here, but
Yeah.
a new way of researching and finding out what it is and what it isn't in your own organization. And then based on that, designing actions and creating experiments on the ground, be they with meetings or be they with how people review the strategy, changing all of that, seeing if it worked. And if it didn't work, changing it again until you found actually this is actually the sweet spot. I mean, this wasn't even just regular meetings across the organizations. We changed how the top team interact on the strategy. You know, we changed the whole thing.
And how did you do that? Like, what did that look like once it was kind of better, let's say? What did it actually look like?
Yeah, we went from meetings in the boardroom to initially better meetings in the boardroom to initially better meetings in the boardroom that included other members of the management team who needed to be there to where we have now is quarterly tracking spaces, which are kind of stand-up meetings with the top team together, going through issues in a kind of a safe space where things are being surfaced that need to be surfaced. So we turned what was essentially a corporate meeting, an effective one, but a corporate meeting. We turned it into a space where top team members can talk honestly and openly about the
Mm.
strategy. That's a very different space to a corporate meeting. Now we still have corporate meetings. You know, some
Yeah, of
meetings are you know, or there's a regulatory element to it where you have to have minutes,
course.
and that's fine. But some meetings are about the strategy, and you're not so shackled by all of that, and you really just want. And the CEO wants to always be seeing, you know, what the blind spots are, where the problems are, and wants to make sure that they find out about them. So you know, you can create different spaces then, and look, that creates all sort of challenges then. Like, this isn't easy. I don't want to say this is easy. Like, I mean,
No.
in terms of challenges, like there are people who would be anxious about, you know, anthropological approaches are pretty transparent. They're kind of out in the open. If you're the kind of person who just, you know, you have to kind of show your hand in a collaborative space. You know, you have to show up. You know, if you're anxious about that for whatever reason, these spaces can be uncomfortable. But again, as we said all along, this is just work. You know, this is nothing personal. There's nothing. Nobody has to
Mhm.
be afraid of anything here. This is about speaking up and being honest and putting the work first. Putting the work first was another phrase we came up with as we did this. To be honest with you, we didn't really have any problems with it either. You know, like it wasn't easy in terms of people getting used to it or building these new habits. And there was in the initially probably the biggest challenge initially was if we set up a squad to work in a certain way with certain collaboration principles, certain action dynamics, and all of that. And like Robert would stay there and he'd mind it for a while, maybe 2 months he'd stay, and from time to time, then, you know, you go back and review it because you have to. And it'd be a little bit like the garden, you know, there'd be a couple of weeds growing up again. And people, yeah, backslide. We called it backsliding. So that became a new problem for us. But I mean, if you change things for the positive way, you know, you're not going to eradicate problems, but you're going to get new problems, hopefully better ones. So we had a better problem than we had now in the beginning. The problem in the beginning was silos. Now we had a better problem, which was, well, the guys were doing this for 2 months and now they've backslided a little bit, kind of into like kind of silo within the thing. But it's a better problem than we had before. How do we fix this?
It's really fascinating, just that even that backsliding piece. I'm sure lots of people have experienced that with all sorts of initiatives. I mean, we've really just touched the surface, as you say here. I mean, I know there'll be people who are listening to this, and there's just so many interesting dimensions to it. And, you know, it's very much a living case study by the sounds of things, you know, where you're monitoring what's going on, you're then changing as you sort of progress through it. But it's just been fascinating listening to you. Thank you so much for joining us. And I'm sure you're very welcome to people getting in touch with you if they're interested from their own organizations in maybe adopting your approach. But any final thoughts, Richard, just in terms of any lessons that you'd say for people in terms of this whole cultural change? Because everybody wants to, they're looking at changing culture and all of that piece. Any final thoughts from you in relation to this?
The main one for me, and just on the contact piece, absolutely, I'm on LinkedIn, and
Yeah,
we've done talks in conferences. We've done academic talks on this. We've published on this, so we have a lot of information. We have a pack on this as well that we present to people. It's about an hour long. So Robert and we really like to go into other organizations and learn from our peers. So anyone who wants us to join them, I'm happy to go in and talk to them. Just
great.
reach out to me on LinkedIn. What I see mostly, Shirley, when I talk to people who work in a similar role as mine, is people are still fixated on, they're still under a spell. And to me, the spell is the belief that, and it's not untrue, it's just that it's taken way too seriously. Culture is mindset. And the amount of times you hear people say, well, we need a mindset, we need to change the mindsets of our employees. You don't need to change the mindsets of your employees. You just don't. You really don't. I doubt does anyone out there who is such a bad actor that their mindset is the problem. That's not the case. Usually the problem is the system that they're trying to operate in, or the clarity of instruction they have, or the way they're incentivized or motivated to change. And these are all practical things, in their organizational world. They're real practical things. They're the meetings they're asked to go to. It's the training they're given. It's the management leadership they feel and experience. So I would say mostly the lesson I've learned and we've learned is, you can really focus on how people do the job and how they do it together, and you can change a lot for good. It would be that sort of realization for me, the premise upon which you go about trying to change the culture. And look, if you really need to change the culture, in our experience, that's how to do it.
Fantastic. That's really great. Richard, thank you so much for joining me today. Thanks for sharing all these really interesting perspectives. I'm sure there's a lot of people will be in contact with you after this. Thanks very much indeed, Richard.
No more. Thank you, Shirley.
And I want to thank you, our listeners, too. I suspect you've come from very different parts of the globe and from within different industries also. And I hope that you have found the discussion as insightful and as thought-provoking as I did. By the way, if you'd like to contact me, you can do that on LinkedIn or on shirleykavanagh.com. To our listeners, I hope this has been as useful to you as it has been for me.